Well, hello and welcome today to the Exponential Australia Church Leaders Podcast. We are delighted that you are joining us today for our last episode of 2025. It has been a wonderful year as we have heard from a wide range of leaders from all across God's church globally and here within Australia. And particularly as we draw our year to a close, it's absolutely wonderful to have a friend of the podcast and someone who will be known to many across the Australian church, Mark Sayers. Mark is the leader of Red Church in Melbourne, Australia, and has become very well known for his acute cultural and spiritual insights of what both the Lord is doing and what is happening in our world. And Mark, it's so wonderful to finally get you on the podcast with us today.
Yeah, great to be here.
Yeah, so great. Well, hey, maybe for those who haven't heard of you, of Red Church, there would be many who have. And of course, you have a wonderful podcast, Rebuilders, that I'm sure many of our guests also co-listen to because you just provide so many interesting insights of what God is doing in and through the church in Australia and globally. You have a very global audience. But I'd love just to start today by giving us a bit of a thumbnail sketch of your life. What's brought you to where you are today? Tell us about your family. Where do you minister from?
Yeah. Well, I'm here in Melbourne and have been here my whole life. My ministry started actually with the Salvation Army. I studied advertising, but in my sort of gap in between year 12 and university, went to the US and worked with an order who works amongst the poor in some sort of, more economically challenged areas, which experienced a lot of sort of gang violence and stuff. And that was a really pivotal change in my life. So I came back, continued with advertising for a bit, but ended up dropping out and started as a Salvation Army intern in youth ministry and then did youth ministry and worked in it for about 10 years for the Salvation Army and then ended up working with Alan and Deb Hirsch at South Melbourne Restoration Community, which became Red. And I took over the east part of that have been then leading Red since, I think I've been the senior at Red since about 2010. And then on the side of that, writing and talking and communicating about various things, but particularly my two passions are sort of renewal and, culture. What is missiology? What does the gospel look like in cultures? And we've learnt a lot about that in, as the gospel went out from, places in the West, to other parts of the developed in the rest of the world. And, but I'm really interested in what does missiology look like in the West. So, that's been a real passion of mine and informs a lot of what I do.
It's brilliant. I love that, Mark. And of course, you're married to Trudy. You guys have got 3 kids, remind me? Yeah.
So I've got Grace, who's just finished high school, and then the twins, Billy and Hudson, who are 14. So I'm married to Trudy, who is on staff at Red, but also the National Director for 24/7 Prayer Australia. So yeah.
So good. We have had Trudy on the podcast before, so for anyone who's listening and wants to go and hear some of Trudy's journey, please do that. But we love 24/7 prayer, cheering it on. It's just a wonderful thing that is unifying the church around prayer in our nation. And so, just wanted to make mention of that. Mark, I'd love to jump straight in the deep end today. And of course, you are very insightful when it comes to what you're observing across the church. And I think part of what catalyzed this podcast, apart from you just being a wonderful person and a great leader in God's church, is I heard some of the insights that you'd recently made at an event, particularly relating to some of the cultural strongholds that can permeate and affect the church in Australia, which I think is, of course, our joint heart. Exponential, Red, 24/7 Prayer, many other wonderful organizations that are wanting to see the kingdom advance in our nation. And I wonder if you'd kind of just riff on that to begin with. Like, what are some of the things, and of course, I know that was for a time and a place and a particular prophetic moment that you were speaking into, but would you just kind of speak to what you've been observing as we are wrapping the year in 2025 and potentially some of the things that church leaders should be aware of that we're grappling with at this time?
Yeah, I think this is really important, and it's actually I'm really excited to just talk to an Australian context, because so often I'm talking to international audiences, and there's some Aussies listening, but you've got to nuance everything. So it's great to speak directly into that, because I actually think there's some things that we are experiencing that the rest of the world is experiencing, but then I think there's some unique things. I'll start in many places. I'll start in one. I think that it's really interesting to understand the unique relationship between faith and culture in Australia. I think spending, a lot of time doing ministry in the US and the UK and Europe and places like that, the story of faith in Australia is quite different. Even the story of faith in Australia is quite different to New Zealand. And there's always been this really interested sort of contestedness around, faith in Australia. Australia in many ways starts as what, some described it early on as a post-Christian culture, that you had, populations, you had, obviously, Indigenous Australians, who'd been here for thousands of years, but the people who then came as part of sort of European expansion into Australia were really people who were convicts. A lot of the women who first came were sex workers. The soldiers who were sent out here, it wasn't the gig you wanted to get. And, at that time, if you look at what was happening in the United Kingdom, a lot of those people were beyond the remit of the church. The Great Awakenings that happened in the 18th century were trying to reach a lot of those people. The first church in Australia, which you can still see the site in Sydney, was burnt down, And, it's just a very different, I always think about that. You go to a lot of cities and, you're marked by great cathedrals, these celebrated sites, and you've got sort of this marker out the front of the metro station in Sydney, which is just like this, it got burnt down, and so there's something around that. Now, Australia can also overemphasize that antagonism towards religion. And there's a stream of Australian history which does that. And there's also this other great story of Australia as a place of awakenings and revivals and, incredible stories. But it's interesting. It's contested, and I find that I think part of also what denotes Australia is that I was talking actually to someone in Germany about this, how Australians don't think about the past, a lot. And, this person was saying, look how much she's like, I can't believe that in Germany is so focused on learning from the past. And I think a part of that is about, the origins of the country, Indigenous history, not wanting to look at that, seeing Australia as terra nullius. There was nothing here before, which is obviously clearly such an error. And then also, I think even the convict story, a lot of people being sent here against their will, but also a lot of migrants escaping where they're from. So what that means is Australia sort of lives in the moment. And I think that's a really unique thing. And a lot of individuals live in the moment. We don't think about what God's done here. So weirdly, Aussies will know often more about what God's done in other countries. American revivals, they don't realize, or English revivals, they don't realize that stuff's happened here. Part of my real joy in the last few years was just in Melbourne, discovering that Melbourne's just been this engine of awakening and revival. And, shocked how many people live in this city, walking past literal sites where that's happened and have no idea. So I think that's one thing, that Australia is a really unique relationship to faith, and it's contextual. We've got to understand that. Because we live in the English-speaking world, you get a lot of fantastic resources, primarily from the US and then secondarily from the UK. But what that can do, and I think this has gotten worse in the time of social media, is that we can then just presume that the context that various things are working in is like our context. The culture's similar. And we're also got a similar-ish digital culture in the world at the moment, people are watching the same shows on Netflix. But I think that can fool us into thinking that, therefore, ministry is going to look the same. The key of missiology is, how does the gospel look like in my context?
Right.
So we're doing two things at the moment. We're doing what does it look like in a global context? Because we're all connected in a way. So we've got to ask, what does the culture look like in a global digital culture? So a 14-year-old, to say, if you're doing a church, a 14-year-old church may have more in common in some ways with a 14-year-old in Iceland or South Korea in the music they listen to, their habits and so on. So we've got to sort of work out what does the gospel look like in that. But then also at the same time, that 14-year-old goes to school in Australia, and not just Australia, they may go to school on the Central Coast or in, wherever, Esperance, so there's sort of like global digital culture, Australian culture, local culture, and all of them are important. And I think we can forget that, and I've had the experience multiple times where when I was younger, I'd go to the US and you'd hear about some fantastic church, and, there may be even Aussies going over there, and you sit with the senior pastor and you spend a week looking at everything that they're doing. And you think, look, you're looking for the magic bullet. What's the secret sauce? There's so many people here. And then you look at it all and you go, actually, oh, my mate down the road's actually doing this better. And hang on, that's not that great. And the secret sauce is they're in America, which has a massive, much more significant Christian culture. It's a larger country. Faith is different. I remember being in Nashville and walking into a coffee shop and looking and like, oh, there's two couple are praying, and hang on, that guy's reading his Bible, and that person's reading The Purpose-Driven Life. Every single table, Christian activity. This was just a Starbucks, not near a church. So I think it's really important for Aussies to realize that our story's different. You're in a different context. It's not going to look the same. There is a greater challenge in some sense. There's challenge and there isn't. I'll get to that in terms of comfort. But I think realizing the question constantly has to be asked, what does this look like in an Aussie culture?
Yeah.
I'll just add one more thing and then I'll stop if you've got any questions. I've got
please.
Multiple things to say on this. Also, understanding an Aussie culture that has radically shifted in the last 3 years. I was on Sunday night at 10 p.m. on the platform at Flinders Street, which is one of Melbourne's main stations. And the platform was pretty full for Sunday night. That's different. I used to do ministry in the city 10 years ago, or no, actually 15 years ago now. It was not full on Sunday night. Like the city's grown, so our population is growing. The second thing is I looked up and down the platform and almost every single person was young, mostly from different Asian countries, various subcontinent, Indians, Bangladeshis, Africans, like everyone on the platform, was from a non-Anglo or even just non-European background. And almost all were young. And I looked up and down and thought, this is very different to what Melbourne even looked like just before the pandemic. So Australian culture is radically shifting. So, for example, what we've realised at Red, we just started a new location. It's majorities people who've just moved to Melbourne in the last 2 years.
Wow.
So it's not just a question of what does Aussie culture look like. I'm going to start carrying around, I don't know, a eucalyptus leaf or something. It's what does Aussie culture look like now? So I can pause there if you've got any other thoughts on that.
No. I'm loving that. And I think even just you riffing on some of what you're observing in Melbourne and that applies across the country. But, in talking about some of those strongholds and those things for us to be aware of as church leaders, how then do we bring the work of the kingdom into those things, potentially even against some of those things that are the work of the world, like particularly as we're looking to go, Lord, I want to be aware of the things that are unique to me as an Australian church leader. How can I bring the kingdom before those things?
Great question. So it's two interesting things of how Australia is different. So, for example, going to the US a lot, seeing this increasingly in Britain and in Europe, polarization is a massive thing. And so I've heard in Australia countless Australian Christian leaders referring to polarization, right? And is it a thing in the world? 100%. Has our politics become a bit more polarized? Yes. But there's this really interesting stat that just before the pandemic, I think it was like 2018, 2019, Pew, probably the world's leading demographers, did a survey globally of political polarization. And what they found was that across the world, so they basically measured before the pandemic, and then I think it was 3 years after the pandemic, so only a couple of years ago. And what they found was that every country pretty much had become far more polarized.
Wow.
But some countries were more polarized than others. So countries like Holland were become highly polarized. The US was massively polarized. And so, you see this everywhere. You see this online. You see this in the American church. It's huge. You've got pastors going this direction, pastors going that direction, worship leaders going this direction, worship leaders going that direction. Pew's statistics on Australia was that Australia became less polarized.
Wow.
And so this is one of the really key things where people actually go, I heard that sermon from the preacher I really admire in the US, and then I'm watching that Instagram story from that guy in the UK talking about that. They're also about polarization. And then I'll bring that to my sermon, or I'll bring that in that teaching or whatever. That's not to say polarization's not an issue, but statistically, it's just not the same. Now, what's confusing is you get people who are looking online, and you get individual figures who are polarized because they just live in the internet world, right? But your average people you're going to meet down the beach or at a cafe or whatever, they're living in a different reality on the ground in Australia. Or the polarizations that you might be having are very different. So, for example, I try to look at all different news sources. That's one of the big things I do. I'm a bit crazy. And, I was watching online the Indian cable news, which is wild. Indian cable news, if you think American, like, cable news is wild, it's like so loud and there's always stuff happening.
If you've ever got free time, go and check out Indian cable news.
That's my tip. That's my one tip for this. But it's really interesting. I was watching, and they're talking about some of the issues around separatism in the Punjab, this want for a Sikh state, and they're crossing to different sites in India, and they're like, and now we're crossing to Melbourne, and it's Flinders Street Station, and there's a massive crowd there, and it's on the ground. They're talking to people there, and there's like two sides, and I'm like, this is a polarization in my city, and I know nothing about it.
Wow!
Like, it's not on Channel 9 News, so those issues actually are in your community. During the Hong Kong protests, I live near Box Hill here, which is very Chinese area. There was significant polarization at the local MPs forum. There was issues, but it doesn't trickle up to possibly your feed unless you're from one of those communities. But that's stuff happening in your community.
Yeah. So
the danger is our eyes are just done by what we see on the digital, and we miss what's going on local. So I think that's one thing. So understand what's going on. That's Australians can look overseas always.
Very good. And
that leads into two things. So number one, actually, I'll hit the stronghold first. So what I began to ask the question was, okay, if America, there's lots of commentary and books on this, there's a lot of talk about then cultural Christianity is political in the US, which I think is 100% true. In the UK, they're starting to see this really seeping into the church in the UK. The UK is sort of heading towards what happened in America in 2020, with a real sort of strong, division in stuff. So you can sort of see that direction and go, well, it's politics. And I began to ask the question, there's definitely cultural Christianity in Australia, but is it politics? Are there some of those people? 100%. You may know them. But I began to realize as I travel around Australia and I listened to pastors, got emails from rebuilders, the overwhelming thing I noticed leaders in Australia dealing with is that the cultural Christianity stronghold of Australia is comfort.
Yes.
It's, I want to live my life and I don't want anyone to mess with that. And I'll come to church and, that's great, you got that guy's event and that. But is church finished by time the football's on? Or we're going away this weekend, we've got a beach house, we've got this, we've got that. When you talk to Aussie pastors, it's the slow burn of that stuff which really gets them. So they get fired up about mission, planting, this or that. What they hit is not a political wall per se. And again, I'm speaking generally. It's, are Aussies willing to push past comfort into kingdom advancement? Very good. And, I think that this is really, really important. And part of the problem is our country is amazing. It is an amazing place. And it's interesting as well. So here's another dynamic that I've noticed as part of that. I was just in Europe in June, July, in Scandinavia. I've ministered there over the years and noticed a profound change in this awakening that's happening amongst primarily young people outside the church, literally just turning up cold turkey to church or asking questions about life. Same thing happened in the UK, quiet revival, stuff happening in the US, turnaround. Now, the thing I began to think is this is going to happen in Australia at the same rate soon. And my assessment is there's tiny parts of it, but it's not as the scale as what I'm seeing and encountering and when I'm just listening to people overseas. Now, part of the reason is as well, one of the things that I've always sort of said is that crisis precedes renewal. When I studied the great awakenings and revival of history, often they were before them, there was like some economic crisis, a war or whatever. And I was talking to people in Europe. I'm like, why are so many people coming? And why is it certain places in Europe? So it's not every country. That's another really interesting thing. Europe is going through a profound identity crisis as America's pulled its security guarantees away. It's experiencing, like Germany had this economic model. It's collapsing. Scandinavia feels extremely fragile. So Denmark's just brought in conscription.
Wow.
I think Norway's brought in conscription. I was thinking about this, and I'm sitting at a cafe, and on the other table to me, there is a whole table of 18-year-old girls in fatigues. I was talking to people in Norway whose kids are on the border looking at Russia across the Arctic border. And the conversation is, it's not if, it's when we go to war with Russia. Now, if you're an 18-year-old in Australia, you may be concerned about cost of living crisis, and I'm not diminishing any of that sort of stuff. Or, can I buy a house? Again, really legitimate stuff, really important stuff. But you're not preparing that in 2 years you could be at war.
Yeah.
You don't have in your church, 300 Ukrainians who have lost, people. And to notice the effect that the war's had in Europe is really substantial. In the US, we're seeing a turnaround, but America's been through such a sort of cultural tumult of polarization and political, it's incredible how many American cities feel like they've really deteriorated and so on, and law and order. It's a real lived thing. The UK is going through a profound economic crisis. The country's, to summarize in simple terms, the country's effectively broke. And, really simple services that we assume they're struggling to, what does the future look like?
Yeah.
Now, Australia has its challenges, but it's really interesting. I heard a interview with Labor strategist, and they said that basically, and a few people have said this, what the current political thing is in Australia is we want politicians who make everything like it was, but not like it was in the 1950s, like it was just before COVID. That almost, this is not a political statement as much as just a cultural observation. This person who's a Labor strategist was saying Albanese's strategy is to basically try and keep Australia as it is while the rest of the world changes. And so that flows into your church. So change then in your church will have an effect. I noticed after the pandemic in Australia, a lot of people moved churches, or particularly Melbourne, probably more of a case study than other places. And people would move churches, and the reason they would move is they would move because they wanted to just be around. Actually, at my church are those friends and my family. I'm going to go there. It's just easier.
Localization.
I heard localization, but not the localization of, wow, I really want to get embedded in my community and stuff like this. This is safe.
Yeah.
So I think, I'd just add one more thing too. Australia is experiencing a cost of living crisis, but if you look at the stats and comparative to other places of the world, because we have mining and resources and industries, it's not the same. There was an article 2 days ago in the Times of London about how English young people are moving to Australia because they just can't find the standard of living coming to Australia. I think it's 1 in 5 Kiwis are now living overseas, the majority in our country and moving.
Wow.
Ireland, again, another article. There's jokes in Ireland about how, half the country's young adults have come to Australia. More Americans are migrating to Australia, significantly more Americans are migrating to Australia than are going the other direction. So if there's something going on in the world, if more people are moving to us than we're moving to them, it says that life here is better and opportunities are better. So that just undergirds the comfort thing in our country. I'm going to talk about other strongholds. I'll pause there. I'm dropping. I always bring lots of information.
No, I love it, Mark. It's so good, and you're bringing so much to our attention today. I guess where my mind goes off the back of you, obviously giving a bit of a global perspective, and you've talked about what's happening in parts of Europe, what's happening in the UK with this quiet revival, that some of the things that have been happening on campuses across the US, this hunger for renewal and awakening. And I guess one of the things that I've been privy to, and particularly as we hear from across the church in Australia, is that there's almost this sentiment that Aussie church leaders are tired of hearing stories from overseas. Like they're tired of hearing what God's doing over there or over there, and actually going, we're desperate for that here in our own nation. And there's this kind of heart to go, where are the signs of renewal here in Australia? And of course, in your seat and with 24/7 prayer and your involvement there, you would be able to kind of see some embers of what might be happening in our nation. And I guess to converge some of what you've kind of been sharing, where are you seeing some of that begin to happen on our own shores, and for Aussie church leaders as we continue to stoke the flames of, oh, Lord, we want to hear those stories here. We want to hear the next generation come back to church. We want to see an increase in disciples being made and churches being planted. Where are some of the signs that you're seeing that happen here in Australia?
Yeah. I think the first thing is, I've heard so many people say, and I feel this, ministry is profoundly different now than it was in 2019. And in a sense, the challenges are always there, but there's an openness and a more seriousness to push in than there was. Why is that? Part of that was, I think, one was a percentage of the Australian church I don't think came back after COVID. It wasn't massive. It depends what city you're in and how long lockdowns were. But I think part of that comfortable Christian, we're just doing this because of rote thing, didn't come back after the pandemic. So those who are here, and, you can look at the stats and stuff like this, like particularly, again, this is what's different to the US. I think we were both at an event that McCrindle had where they shared some data about the Australian church from the census. And one of the really interesting things is often overseas, and then that trickles down here, millennials are maligned for not being committed and stuff like this. From memory, the data actually said that millennials are actually quite committed in their church attendance and volunteerism and so on. Why is that? Well, the millennials who still tick Christian on the census actually mean it. So there's an element that those who have stuck around are fair income in the majority. That's a really good thing. I would rather lead 200 fully committed people than 1,000 uncommitted people or wishy-washy people. So we've had that. So there's been a focusing, a coalescing, and you hear that across the Aussie church. The second thing is that there is an unprecedented openness. I was just talking to someone from a small regional town, and they're just like, the conversations they're having are incredible. You see that in big cities, small cities. I mean, to give you an example, this funny story. I was with Gerald and Jenny Griffin from Bridgetown, and they were in Melbourne, the church, and I'm showing them around Melbourne. I'm talking how sort of secular Melbourne is, and I was showing them St. Patrick's Cathedral, the Catholic cathedral in Melbourne. And we walk up to the steps, and I see this guy bending over the steps, and I presumed it was a homeless guy or some guy who was, drug affected or something. And we get closer, and I think, his actually clothes are pretty clean and nice. And we get there, and he's kneeling on the steps of the cathedral praying. He'd be 21, 18, 19. And I was sort of like, this is a bit embarrassing. I'm telling the story how secular Australia is, and here's this guy. You didn't see stuff like that 10 years ago.
No.
At church, we've got guys who've just always been part of the youth group, and they're sort of almost being disrupted a little bit because their friends are now asking them questions. So there is this trickle-down effect in the media, which you will get from the overseas stuff. I don't think our media's picked it up in the same way. But again, too, this is where the digital overseas things works in our favour, that all of a sudden, for a certain age group, the cultural taboo around Christianity has gone, and there's an openness. Now, again, too, I said Australia is still experiencing cost of living crisis. The awesome life that you could have, a lot of people find that more distant. Mental health challenges, personal challenges. The secular story is falling over globally, and it's falling over in Australia. I don't think it's just collapsed as quickly. So what you're finding is, I think there is a far more tremendous opening out there. And I think what people need to do in the Aussie church is to adjust to that is, I think so many of us have got a thing that if I chat to someone at a bus stop, wherever, they're going to be so offended because Aussies don't like religion. Yeah. But I think the alpha stats is like 1 in 4 Australians, if nicely asked, would come to church or something like that. That's far higher than we realise. So I think the one thing is that there's a tremendous openness out there. Yeah. So first thing, we've coalesced into a committed core. 2, there's an openness out there. But 3, what I'm noticing is, and I noticed this after the pandemic, is I think as things get tougher, and look, reduction is still happening. Our denominations are overwhelmingly grey. Nothing against older people, but it's just simple demographics. What we're going to see in the next 10 years is significant decrease in the size of the Australian church, simply because of ageing. That's just, unless there's a significant turnaround. The sort of last thing that's happening is, I think that's then waking people up to that we need to work together. Just at the installation of Bishop Rick Thorpe, the new Anglican Archbishop of Melbourne. And I was amazed at the just diversity of churches that were represented and cheering each other on, and the connection of relationships. 24/7 events, we're just seeing people turn up who would not normally be in the same room together.
Yeah.
And that's not just 24/7 events. I'm sure you experienced that with Exponential. Like, we're seeing that across the board.
Yeah.
Tribes who wouldn't hang out, all of a sudden realizing that perhaps we've got more in common than we thought, and we've got to band together. So I think they're the big three things. I think it's a coalesced, committed few. There is an openness in the culture that I don't think we're tapping into. I do wonder, I know this is just a theory, are the Europeans seeing more fruit because they're actually prepared for more fruit?
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? I mean, Pete Gregg's made the comment like about the Quiet Revival. Well, we have been praying for 25 years, whatever it is,
Yeah.
Have we, the Australian Church, been really contending and praying for 25 years that people will come without an agenda, And so I think those three things. So just to add one more thing.
Please.
I think that positions us brilliantly. But to return to your original point, Australians have a cultural cringe. We love the Aussie who does a restaurant in London and succeeds. There was an article of one of the top, first Australian, I think, to get a Michelin star. She's passed away recently in London. We love the success story. We love the director who goes to Hollywood, the actor, the Formula One driver, the Premier League footballer, Aussie who makes it overseas. Part of that is because we feel rejected. And there's lots, and Manning Clark and all tons of different people spoke about sometimes this sense of cosmic orphanhood. So we've got to prove ourselves.
Yeah.
I think what that can mean is, I find this always, like, I just find this thing continue where I'll be overseas in America, like I go check out this cafe or something, and you drive halfway across town and you get there and it's okay. It's sort of like an Aussie cafe. And then you're sort of sitting there and you realize, like, hang on, I can walk 200 meters and I've got 5 of these.
Yes.
And so there's this weird thing, because it's overseas, it's better.
Yeah.
And my experience is so often it's not. Now, that's not to disparage the rest of the world or anything like that. But I think part of perhaps going and seeing being around some of these awakening things, they're amazing, but also maybe they're not as different as you think to some of the stuff that's happening here. Like, honestly, like, if we heard that a awakening was breaking out in Shepparton, would as many Aussies go there if a massive revival broke out in New York, London, or Paris?
Yes.
There's almost, what good can come from Nazareth a little bit around this, And so I actually, the thing, I actually wonder, the stories we get at Rebuilders, and a lot of people send in stories, there's stuff happening. A lot of it's rural. A lot of it's out of suburbs. A lot of it's in churches where, like, in Australia, we met some of the Coptic church guys. There's been a renewal amongst Coptic youth in Australia.
Yes.
It's the Egyptian church. Who knows about it? Going to Coorong's and buying out everything. Who no one knows about this because, it's the Coptic church in Australia. So there's an element where I think we need to reverse the sort of spiritual tourism, and that, I don't mean that harshly. I've gone and learned from stuff overseas. But I think we need to recognize, like, what could he be doing here and what's the unique thing? And just add one extra layer. Like, I also think that standing on the platform on Flinders Street Station on Sunday night, I looked up and down the platform and saw people from all over Asia who've come to my city. Melbourne and Sydney increasingly feeling more international. I know it's not everywhere. Like, I think, but it's not an internationalness that's connected to Europe per se or America. It's connected to the Pacific and Asia. And if it is the Asian century, which many predict it is, Australia has this fascinating bridge. We're a bridge between East and West, the West and Asia, very global in our thinking. And so what if God's actually positioned for something to do here, but that goes beyond?
Wow. Mark, I get this sense that, that's that kind of little way that you wrapped this segment of the conversation is actually what the Lord wanted to deposit in our listeners' hearts today. And while I've while I've got probably another half a dozen questions that I'd love to ask you, I actually think they're better served for another time. And so as we wrap this year and the podcast, and as we all begin to head into Advent season and celebrating what it's all about, just wanted to take the time to thank you for your contributions both today, but also for the Aussie Church, the way that you're kind of raising some of these flagpoles and causing us to think differently, and wanted to take the time on behalf of Exponential to really honour your voice, because I do think we sit in quite an interesting time for the church in Australia, and we're all passionate about seeing the kingdom advance. And I just wonder if that moment of actually going, well, let's not continue to both export and import the church in Australia, but actually see the kingdom come in our own nation, and of course with a heart for the nations. And yet I think we stand at an interesting crossroads right now as we seek to see a sense of humility, tearing down those strongholds that we've talked about today. And we just definitely join you in many of the anecdotes that you've shared. And so thank you for your time, and thank you for the contributions that you've made today and towards the Aussie Church.
Oh, pleasure. It's been so good to chat, and cheering everyone on. I think, we need to, encourage each other at this time, and it's exciting. I'll end on this comment. I'm the most hopeful I've ever been.
Come on. Love that. What a way to end, and what a way to wish us a very Merry Christmas. So thanks for being with us today, Mark.
Pleasure.